Step in my dojo, you
Step in my dojo, you
step in my.
It's weekly download time. 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 And now we're going to learn some stuff because it's download time. It's weekly download time. It's weekly download time. It's weekly download time. It's weekly download time. And now we're going to learn some stuff. What's up, guys? How's it going? I'm joined here by Vaden. We're working on some top secret stuff. I'm not allowed to live stream, unfortunately, but yeah, we got something really cool and secret on the go. But I thought I would just take a minute to do a weekly download because we were having this conversation earlier about cognitive biases, and I think it's probably worth addressing in a weekly download just because I think it's like, probably a lot of you have thought about this stuff, but not everyone has thought about this stuff. And it's really, really important to know about cognitive biases and to really uproot them in your own thinking. Okay, so there's this thing that can actually be measured called teachability. And it's a concept in psychology that basically it's a measure of how receptive you are to new information, right? And like when you're a kid, you're like a sponge, right? Like everything is new, everything is to be explored, and you don't really approach things with the same kind of like closed mind that you develop as you become older. So you start with a really, really high teachability index when you're a baby and a kid, and then after you kind of get to graduating high school or graduating university, your teachability index goes way fucking down because in your mind, you know your shit and you feel like you know your shit and that's all there is to know, right? And you can close your mind to learning really, really easily because you feel like you have learned a lot. And I find like the people who really excel, right, are people who are able to hold on to that beginner's mind, right? Now, if you study Buddhism, it's the same kind of concept in Buddhism is beginner's mind, where you're basically trying to cultivate a receptiveness to new information and a receptiveness to new experience, right? And in Buddhism, when you start meditating, it's like, in your first like year or so of meditating, you'll get like some pretty strong gains, and you'll be able to meditate. Usually like you have a pretty kind of dramatic change between no Buddhism and meditation to like a year worth of Buddhism and meditation. But the problem is when you're meditating all the time for years, it starts to become really routine and you start to feel like, okay, here I am meditating. You're not like thinking, because when you're like meditating, it's basically you're stilling the mind and you're stopping your mind from endlessly grasping on another thought and another thought and another thought, which is kind of like the natural tendency of the mind, right? And after you've been meditating for a few years, it's hard not to think, here I am meditating, right? And you end up basically kind of going backwards in a lot of ways because you're experienced, right? So in Buddhism, they recommend that you cultivate the beginner's mind, and there's different like, exercises and kind of like, things you can read about it that will help you to get back into beginner's mind. But it's important as a producer to cultivate beginner's mind too, because basically like the people basically like the people who are really excellent at things, the people who get really, really excellent at things, they're always learning and they're always sponging up new information and they're always open-minded to it. And one of the big enemy, whether it's in beginner's mind or whether it's in cultivating a receptiveness to new information or increasing your teachability, the big element here is ego, right? And basically, a lot of us, we have this idea that we're, that our worth as a person is tied to being right all the time. And when you're not giving yourself permission to be wrong about things, right, and you like to think of yourself as someone who is right about things, it can really cut you off from new information and it can cut you off from learning, right? But if you can learn to celebrate your mistakes and celebrate when you're wrong about something and really treat that as a victory for progress, a victory for expanding your mind, and really, really celebrate when you're wrong and celebrate when you make mistakes, you'll be able to do things that are outside of the box and they're outside of the kind of typical rule following sort of application of knowledge, right? So in my breakthrough workshops and pretty much a lot of my other teaching, I'm really trying to help people to learn to celebrate making mistakes and to embrace mistake making as part of the creative process. But I think it's also important to really celebrate when you find out that you're wrong about something. Right. So, for example, what sparked this conversation, we were in the other room, we were talking about all these new studies that have come out that have shown conclusively that MSG is not bad for you, despite all of the hype that we had going into recent times. Like it was always taught like, yo, MSG is terrible for you. If you eat Chinese food, you're gonna poison yourself, and it's just like the worst fucking thing. And I thought this too. I thought this for years, and I would go into the Chinese restaurants and be like, is there MSG in it, and like be a real fucking stickler about it. But it turns out that's just not based on science. That there was a few kind of flawed studies about it, but it was really like, kind of a little bit racist that we were all bagging on MSG so hard. And it really because people had already had a cognitive bias against Chinese people, the MSG thing became a reason to express racism with a seemingly rationalized basis, and it was like really latched onto by a lot of people, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And we now know this to be wrong. For example, like eating fat. It used to be thought that eating fat would make you fat, and that if you just avoided fat, you wouldn't get fat. But now we know that it's sugar that makes you fat, and it's carbohydrates that make you fat. And, when you talk to people about it, hence the popularity of like keto diets and all these other things are based on this new knowledge. And, anytime you get a new piece of knowledge, whether it's about music production or diet or whatever else, right? I encourage you to use a practice called cognitive dissonance. And cognitive dissonance is basically the idea that to be able to engage in cognitive dissonance, you need to disengage.
I feel so great. It's the best decision I made to really take my music skills to the next level. I just feel so much confidence now in the process, and just kind of, writing without having inspiration. Like when else in my life I thought that would be possible, and now I can sit down and have like 3-4 ideas, 4 drops, because I learned drops paid the bills.
Yes.
And I had like 4 awesome drops done in a day, and that's just mind blowing.
Dissonance. You need to disengage your ego from whatever the piece of information is, right? So you need to let go. You need to say, hey, I'm going to attach myself to neither of these opposing viewpoints, but for the sake of analysis And for the sake of critical thinking and for the sake of being thorough, I'm going to adopt the opposing viewpoint and play like devil's advocate for whatever this perspective is. And I find like, a lot of the time, like, for example, there's the whole like -6 dB limit. Everyone's told like, oh yeah, you want to make sure you have 6 decibels between your highest peak and then 0 dB when you're making a mixdown. But that standard, right? It's like, I mean, it works. It's a great standard, but it's based on analog systems, and those guidelines were a lot more important than analog systems than they are in the kind of like in the box production that we do now. And actually pretty much as long as you don't actually cross 0 dB and clip, your mix down is totally masterable. As long as you just haven't clipped it at any point, you're fine. You could hand it in at -12, you could hand it in at -1. It's pretty much all the same if you're working in the box, right? And you're going to learn stuff like that all the time that is challenging like basic kind of fundamental shit about what you know. And really, if you're going to become excellent at music, you need to be ahead of the curve. You need to be ahead of these waves of knowledge propagation that are going through the music production community. And if you always want to stay at the cutting edge, right, you can't identify yourself with any of these opinions and with any of these pieces of knowledge that you have. You need to say, hey, this is information. It may or may not be wrong, but your value as a human being has nothing to do with whether that information is correct or not. And as time progresses, we learn again and again and again as a species that everything we thought was wrong, again and again and again. And you can either learn faster and find out that you're wrong sooner, or you can be grudgingly one of the last to grudgingly admit that you're wrong. But I kind of go through the life with the assumption that I'm wrong about almost everything, right? And that's okay. And if you go through life with the assumption that you're doing the best with what information you have, but that most of it is probably wrong at some level, right? And if you just assume that you're wrong about everything at some level, like you might be making a good go with the information that you have, but just assume you're wrong about everything and assume that there's always more to learn about everything, and there's like we're learning so fast now. Technology is progressing so quickly. Music production is progressing so quickly that assumption is really going to help you to keep an open mind and to learn better, right?
It's like